The thing that I wanted to discuss is science in the Bible and things that the Bible gets wrong scientifically. There's so many different ways you can go with this, and you can go with examples like in Genesis 30:37. It says that Jacob was breeding goats, and any goats that came out with stripes would be his, or maybe even with spots, and then the ones that didn't have them would not be his. So his plan to create more striped goats was to put striped sticks in front of the watering trough where he watered his goats. And that way, that's where they would mate. They would breed there, and then of course, seeing these striped sticks while they were breeding would create striped goats, and then he would get more goats. Um, Obviously, that's not the way things work. Obviously, stripes would be genetics, and have nothing to do with what the goats were observing while they were mating. And another example is like Mark 4:31, where you have the parable of the mustard seed, and Jesus is saying, the mustard seed, it's the smallest of all seeds on earth, and he was comparing faith to that. But we know that the mustard seed is not the smallest seed on earth. There are smaller seeds like the poppy seed, wolfia seed. So, you have obviously an example there where the people writing the story were only familiar with seeds in their geographical region. They knew the mustard seed to be the smallest in that area, and obviously the creator of everything would have known there was smaller seeds. Of course, I mean, these aren't the greatest examples necessarily because, like we've been talking about, there's different translations and how you interpret things. But, there's plenty more examples, things like the Adam and Eve, first of all, because it isn't possible for all of humanity to have arisen out of one initial mating pair, out of just one male and one female. Genetics tells us that. You got inbreeding depression, you got just too many problems that would arise from that. There's just no way we could get the diversity we have now with starting off with that. And genetics tells us that the smallest human population that ever existed was a few thousand individuals. And then, of course, if you don't have Adam and Eve, like we mentioned earlier, and you don't have the fall of man and all that, then what do you need Jesus for? What is he redeeming you for? So that's a pretty big problem right off the bat, right there in the beginning in Genesis. Then you also have the fact that there's no evidence for a global flood. Obviously, Noah's family again would be repopulating the earth with just a few individuals, which it's the same problem you're going to have as with Adam and Eve. But these are just good examples. But I think the best examples of where the Bible gets science wrong is when it tries to go into cosmology. It says that the earth is flat, the earth has corners, it's held up by pillars, it has a firmament, it has waters above and waters below. Obviously we know the waters below, those are like the oceans, the seas, and things like that. But there's no waters above, okay? So they were pretty much considering rain and precipitation as coming from, somewhere above the earth. Like the earth was surrounded by water, essentially, and like the proverbial floodgates would open, and that's what caused rain to come down. Essentially, and especially for like the flood story. And then along with the firmament, you also have the fact that they believe that the stars and the moon and the sun were all embedded in this firmament, and the whole thing kind of rotated around the earth. And obviously we know that's not the case. The moon certainly revolves around the earth, but we orbit the sun, of course. And it's not this fixed dome. The idea is that the stars and everything were fixed in this firmament, but obviously that's not the case. We're hurtling through space, and the stars are millions and billions of light years away and all that. And then it says things like the moon is a lesser light. Well, the moon is not producing light. It's of its own. It's obviously reflecting the sun's light. Once again, something that more primitive men would not have known. They're just trying to explain how they see things and how they saw the world. Whereas if it were divine revelation, it would not say something like that. It would kind of describe what's going on there. And also there's parts of the Bible where it says that stars can fall down to earth. And obviously that's not happening because the closest star we have is the sun, which is 93 million miles away, and all the other stars are much farther away from that. They are not going to be falling to earth. In fact, the stars are all much larger than the earth, so if anything, the earth would be falling to a star. So, there's just no reconciling that with what we know about the universe. And I know a lot of times apologists and Christians will try to say, oh, well, the Bible's not a science book. It's not meant to be a science book. But, if it was really revelation from the creator of the universe, it should not have false information in there about these things. At best, it should have just avoided it, or it could have been really vague so that we couldn't say, hey, it's definitely not, doesn't have this right. So when it comes to science, the Bible definitely gets a lot wrong. And also, even if the Bible were to get things scientifically correct, that still wouldn't prove that a God exists. That just means that people back then maybe made some good observations and figured a few things out, but it doesn't mean that a God necessarily existed. So that's an important thing to remember, I think. So that pretty much sums up my comments on science in the Bible. I did just want to mention a couple of other things. A couple of my favorite verses, kind of going back to Dieter's malevolent God thing. Numbers 31:17 is my favorite Bible verse, where Moses is telling the Israelites to go out and kill all the male and females and everybody except for the young virgin girls, and they get to keep them for themselves. And obviously, what does that remind you of? In today's day and age, something like Boko Haram. They're going out and they're killing everybody that they run into, but they're keeping the young girls. And why are they doing that? Because they're very impressionable. They can bring them into their ranks. They can obviously use them to impregnate them, to get more people into their movements, into what they're doing, indoctrinate them, and all that. So we see that even still today, but that's in the Bible, supposedly decreed by God. And everybody talks about the sacrifice of Isaac, where God stepped in at the last moment. But a less familiar story might be the story of Jephthah, where he offered, if he was victorious in battle, he said he would offer up the first thing he saw when he arrived back home to God. And the first thing he saw when he got back after his victorious battle was his only daughter. His only child was his daughter. And he followed through on that. He sacrificed his daughter because he promised to God that he would do so. So those are just a couple of examples of things that kind of back up what Dieter was saying, and I just wanted to add those to the discussion. But that kind of wraps up what I had to say. So I will kick it back to Alis or GE, whoever wants to put in their piece next.
There's a couple of things I wanted to mention there. As you were talking about science and the Bible and how it tried to transcend genetics with the whole spotted and striped incident. Well, not only did it attempt to transcend genetics, but it also makes the implication that spotted and striped cattle, goats, chickens, things of that nature are lesser or weaker than their fully colored counterparts. And that is definitely evident when Laban tells Jacob that his wages are going to be the spotted, or his wages are going to be the striped, and it's kind of sort of like a punishment. I also wanted to mention here that you mentioned Boko Haram and the cultures and about how they went to these towns and they're killing people. I think they had a death toll the other day of about 2,000 people that they murdered in cold blood, but they're taking the young women on. And some of these cultures are very similar to these ancient cultures in which women don't have rights. So that's a thing, and that's why the women are so valuable, because they don't have a right. Their primary purpose is to give them heirs or give them people that are going to carry on these sentiments that they have for others, or their religion, basically. I also wanted to mention here, you talked about cosmology, so we have some apologetics. People will try to say that the Bible is divinely inspired, and one of the theologians that I studied under said that this is how he held things. He said that people who were divinely inspired to write these texts were writing within their own knowledge and their own time, and that God only inspired them to write. He didn't give them the foreknowledge that stars couldn't fall to the earth. And they only wrote about what they thought. So at that time, they thought that the moon produced light. They thought that the moon was a source of light. Now that's one of the apologetics that you do encounter. And if this is supposed to be the Word of God, then this is some bullshit, okay? This is supposedly an omniscient God who knows everything, but wouldn't you think that his one attempt to communicate with humanity, he would want to get this shit right? That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I really can't stand when they try to make that argument, because they're basically saying that, like, You know, it's funny, like, you know, God's power or ability to communicate to people is limited by our ability to understand. So because people back then apparently couldn't understand how things really were, he gave them a really dumbed down version that's actually not accurate. And then, you know, he's obviously not revealing information to us today. We have to go out there and do the work for ourselves. So again, what kind of plan is that? You know, you're going to give a bunch of bad information and then kind of disappear for the next few thousand years and expect us to go off that bad information that you gave people back then just because they were too stupid to understand. The argument just doesn't make sense. It's very obvious that they were just trying to figure out, you know, things that they observed and explain them, and they were invoking God as a reason that as why you should believe this. And that's not unique to the Bible. That's what a lot of cultures and religions do. And so that argument, I get a kick out of that one pretty much.
Yeah, and you did a video recently called "Religion: The First Attempt at Science," and I know that we got a lot of haters that came onto that video. I know I posted it on the page, and people were like, "Oh, religion never did science." But the key word here is attempt. People were attempting to understand the world, and they were just documenting it the best way that they knew how. Now, obviously, we can take an outside stance on this and look back at this objectively and realize that that is what they were doing. They were simply attempting to understand the world, and they failed. They didn't have the scientific method. They didn't have the technology that we have today. And so we need to move on past this Bronze Age nonsense.